I'm delighted to welcome Rachel Dunk and Chris Paling, who are going to talk about carbon auditing and real world assessment. And I know in our discussions, they are going to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So hopefully that will be useful for everybody. So thank you very much, and over to you, Rachel and Chris.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting myself and Chris to talk to you all today, and hopefully we'll have some really rich discussions at the end. There is a change in the title of our talk, which I'll come on to in a moment. So we're going to be looking at energy and carbon accounting and management, and that link to real world or authentic assessments. Before we start, we'll just introduce ourselves. So I'm Rachel Dunk. I'm a principal lecturer in environmental management and sustainable development in the Department of Natural Sciences at Manchester Met, and I led the development of our current undergraduate environmental science programme a few years ago now. In terms of my background, I started life as a chemist, so I did chemistry, then changed over to earth science and chemical oceanography, postdoced in the ocean chemistry of the greenhouse gases, but then I left academia for about 7 years and worked for a charity doing carbon auditing and management. So during that time, worked with a wide range of different stakeholder groups, from primary school children and community groups to large corporates and the Scottish Government, and developed and delivered the country's and indeed the world's first MSc in carbon management, which we ran in partnership with Glasgow University. So I'll hand over to Chris to introduce himself.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Chris Paling. I'm a senior lecturer in environmental management here at Manchester Met. I started after leaving university studying at Manchester Met. I worked here for 3 years, and then I went to work at Manchester Airport for 11 years as an environmental manager, and then returned back to academia and Manchester Met 11 years ago. In my current role, I teach, and I also do a lot of research and advisory work with the aviation industry, both UK, European and globally, on this whole sustainability agenda, but most specifically and increasingly net zero. I'm also chair of an advisory board to the UK sustainable aviation industry, and I'm also on an advisory board for airport carbon accreditation, which is a global carbon management standard for airports. So similar to Rach, having spent some time outside of academia and also in our current roles, we have a lot of contact with outside organisations around the whole net zero area. And I think that gives us a lot of useful insights, and it also gives me some great anecdotes for the teaching as well. Okay.
Thanks very much, Chris. So between us, it's a little bit disappointing because it helps to reveal our age. But what did we work out? We had 18 years of experience outside academia and 27 years of experience inside academia between us. So the reason we expanded the title of our talk to include energy is simply and purely we can't address the climate issue without addressing the energy issue. If we look at global emissions, around 3/4 comes from our generation and use of energy, and around 1/4 from everything else. So actually addressing the energy problem, the energy challenge, alongside addressing the transition to net zero is an integral part of that. So in terms of what we're going to touch on today, it's by no means a comprehensive look at how we've embedded skills for net zero in our programme. We're sort of cherry picking some examples out. So in our undergraduate programme, we're going to talk dominantly about our level 4 and level 5 units. So at level 4, we have a core unit, natural resources, where around half of that unit focuses on the energy challenge, and we start to introduce some key skills there. At level 5, we have an optional unit. Well, that's actually Chris's unit. Level 4, Chris and I co-teach. Level 5, Chris will talk about, he leads the unit on sustainability of organisations. And then at level 6, I lead an optional unit on the circular economy. And those units sit on both our environmental science and our geography programmes. We're not going to talk about our postgraduate talk today, just to highlight that we do also follow these skills through to our master's students as well. And in response to some of the discussions and the feedback that we just heard in the room there about the importance of field lab and field skills, just to highlight that we also have core units for our environmental scientists that have a lot of the nature-based solutions elements in them. So carbon storage, for example, and emissions associated with deforestation, peatland carbon storage, blue carbon, so salt marsh restoration and so on. And again, that's another area where blue carbon is one of my active research areas, and we're working with the Environment Agency, with large consultancies. We're part of a national level forum that is bringing together policymakers, consultants, academics to sort of develop the standards that are needed in this area. And that's something we get our students directly involved in, and typically feeds through to a large number of final year projects focusing in those areas as well. So anyway, back to what we're focusing on today and these undergraduate units. Before we go into a little bit of detail on each of them, just to say a bit about our general approach to learning, teaching and assessment related to this. And again, we heard about the importance of active learning, learning by doing, about making those links through to potential future careers, and also the importance of real world or authentic assessment. And we've tried to build that into our whole approach of how we interact with our students. So this is sort of showing a simple flow, if you like. There will be lecture elements where we need to provide context and underpinning knowledge. We'll always try and have some interactive elements in those lecture segments, and where we can, they tend to be integrated with the workshop. So we'll have sort of a mini lecture, then we'll do a worked exercise, then we'll come back to the next issue that we need to add into what we're thinking about. Very often, what we're looking at has, apologies, the dogs have clearly seen someone outside. Can you hear? Need to put my fingers in my ears. There'll often be a foundational element to what we're doing, and then something that's more extended where we bring in some deeper considerations. So in those cases, we'll have a first workshop that looks at those foundational elements. We'll do step-by-step examples that we work through in class. The students will then have directed study, which is more practice with what we've looked at in class, where we ask them to attempt all the exercises before the next session. When they come back, we'll review those more practice with exercises, and then we'll introduce the extended considerations in another worksheet that we go through step by step. Again, we give reinforcement on that with some more directed study where they get the answers, they can check their understanding. All of this is supported by weekly support sessions that we host on Teams. So it's an hour dedicated office hours, if you like, for the unit, and feeds into a directly related component of their assessment, which we normally make available immediately with submission right at the end of the unit. So they can build those skills and crack on and make sure that they've got a really good understanding straight away. So that level 4 unit on natural resources, as I said, about half of that focuses on the energy challenge. The 3 workshops that we do that sort of really help to build real world skills, net zero skills. First of all, energy literacy. I would imagine it's the same for many people in the room, but our intake has a very wide range of competence and confidence in their numeracy skills. And you really can't do any of this without having a good solid foundation in numeracy. And they also tend to have minimal, if any, understanding of the relationship between power and energy, and simple things like understanding what their gas bill or their electricity bill is telling them. So we do spend a bit of time just building those very basic skills, calculating energy consumption, so looking at the power rating of a kettle and how long it takes to boil, how much energy have you consumed, building on that gradually. So this is really tangible examples from their own lives, to comparisons with if you washed your clothes on a cold wash versus if you washed your clothes at 40 degrees or 60 degrees. When we've done that, we then move on to sort of national level statistics, looking at UK energy supply and converting between all the different units that you're going to come across in different documents or different data sets. So that sort of underpins, and that's all I'm going to say about that one. And then we've got two much more exciting and interesting workshops where we look at renewable energy generation. We look both at the macro and the micro scale. So at the macro scale, we tend to use offshore wind farms. We get them to estimate the energy generation from the wind farm and then express that as commonly used equivalency. I'll say more about that in a moment. And then at the micro scale, we look at a solar PV installation, domestic scale solar photovoltaic installation, where we get them to estimate the energy generation and evaluate the financial benefits. So saying a little bit more about those second two workshops, this is actually the real marketing information for the Dogger Bank wind farm development. So on the left-hand side, you can see the About Dogger Bank wind farm. And one of the points made here is households powered around 4.5 million. And then on the right-hand side, it's telling us about one of these enormous turbines that are going in on this development, how much carbon dioxide it can save. And then it expresses that as an equivalent number of vehicles, the emissions generated by an equivalent number of vehicles in 1 year. Now, there's a major flaw with this calculation in that it uses the US EPA equivalencies calculator, and the average American car is nothing like the average UK car. So we use this to introduce our students, sort of highlight that these are things that are happening in real life. When they're reading news articles, these types of comparisons are very, very frequently used, and then we take them through how to do that. So I'm not going to take you through the detail, but I am going to take you through the calculation steps that we do with them. So first of all, they calculate the nameplate capacity of the wind farm. Then they calculate the theoretical maximum energy output per year. So that's taking into consideration some technical factors. They calculate the average actual energy output per year. And then they express that energy generated as the number of UK homes powered equivalent. Then we also calculate the emission savings that would arise from displacement of fossil fuel electricity. We calculate the emissions from an average UK car in 1 year. And then we make our second comparison, which is expressing the emission savings as the number of UK cars taken off the road equivalent. So they tend to really enjoy that one. Then the second workshop we drill down into quite a bit more technical detail on this one, domestic scale solar PV. They calculate the potential energy generation, and that's taking into account the seasonality. So the bar chart shown here is showing that mismatch between demand and generation. So understanding the variability alongside the intermittency in our renewable resource is really key to understanding what we're going to need to address the challenge. So we look at both the variation across the year, but then also the mismatch between household demand in the orange on a daily basis and supply from your PV panels in the blue. So we talk about the need for battery storage, for example, to optimize the energy generation, and then they estimate the financial benefits, both the return on investment and the payback period for solar PV only, for solar PV with a battery, Based on that, they identify both feasible and optimum options in a given setting. And then we also ask them to identify and explain factors we haven't considered in our calculation that could affect the financial case for installing the panels. So I think, oh no, I did have one more slide. This is just to sort of highlight, they then get their assessment that will give them a new situation that uses the same skills. So we'd only looked at an individual household circumstance in class, and then they get a scenario where you've got two houses on the same road, different orientations, and they have to do that exercise again and make their recommendation for what each of those households should install. Solar PV with a battery, or it just doesn't make sense for them. And with that, Chris, I'm over to you.
Thanks, Rach. So as Rachel said, we have a level 5 unit, second year unit. It's optional, but it's very popular with our environmental science and geography students as well. And the whole unit is sort of constructed around, you know, how do organizations actually grapple with the sustainability challenges. And that's what we talk throughout the unit. And it's very much, again, set in the real world. So we look at what organizations' current practices and the direction that organizations are heading in, because trends do start to become apparent in terms of how they manage these issues. Now, you know, carbon management arguably couldn't happen without a carbon footprint. It's a sort of fundamental initial step to establishing where you set your priorities in terms of strategy and mitigation. And so we take the students through a process where we look at an organization's scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Now, for those of you who are familiar with carbon accounting, there are also something called scope 3. We do talk to the students about scope 3, but we don't go into any detail in terms of calculations on scope 3 because it is a slightly more complicated area, and for most of the students, if not all, it's the first time they've come across this, and so we want to try and keep it manageable, so we stay focused on scope 1 and scope 2. The other one I was going to talk about as well is piece of work we do on constructing a business case. So, you know, for an organization's decision making, it's reliant upon business cases. There's a lot around a business case, and I've had experience of this in my time at Manchester Airport. So it isn't just doing the calculations, there's an element of lobbying for that business case as well. And also you've got to convey the importance to the organisation, sometimes in both the short term and the long term. So I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, Rach. Thank you. So the carbon footprint calculation, what we give the students, and you'll see here on the right of the slide, is a scenario of a model organisation which we put together based on, you know, what this would look like for a real company. And we tried to make the data as relevant to a real company situation as possible. So the students have to work through this information that's provided on the right and then establish what are the actual sources of emissions. So they have to then identify which of those are scope 1 and which are scope 2. So where Rachel was saying, we give them some lecture material to start with to actually talk through the definitions of scope 1 and scope 2 that are given in the greenhouse gas protocol, which is, for those who don't know, is the global standard that's widely used by just about every organisation that does carbon footprinting. So they go through the data and they have to identify the scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then they're given additional supporting information during the lectures as to how to go about establishing the emission factors to put alongside that activity data to actually do the calculation. And this is the actual example here of what that actually looks like in practice. So having gone through the information on the right, they will have identified transit vans using diesel, the managing director's car using petrol, 2 gas ovens, and then the electricity used by the organisation. They take the emission factors from the UK government database, which is updated on an annual basis. Again, is where all organisations, certainly in the UK and some internationally, actually look for in terms of emission factors. So the amount of kilograms of CO2 per litre or per kilowatt hour. Okay, thanks, Rach. And then, so this is publicly available. ASSERT is a tool that's actually been produced by Airports Council International. So that's the trade association for all world airports. So they have produced this carbon footprinting tool to help airports around the world actually do their footprinting. And we take the students through this because in effect, what they have done is exactly what this is. Now, this is related specifically to an airport operator situation, but the calculations are basically identical. So we do talk through with the students this database. It has an input screen and then an output screen because the emission factors are actually built in. And we just show them, you know, not only is what they're doing directly relevant to what's happening in the real world here in the airport sector, but also how, you know, the way they're doing the calculations are exactly what you will be doing if you were doing this in a consultancy or environmental advisor management type role. Thanks, Rach. And then the other example from the Sustainability of Organisations unit is developing a business case. In this case, it's for an energy efficiency measure or intervention. So here again, information is provided to the students. That is the information you can see here on the right. And then they have to use that information to calculate annual savings in energy, carbon, and financial. And then they are guided through sessions on how to then calculate the financial return on investment and payback period, and the carbon return on investment and payback period. It's also important to ask them to then go through this and identify and explain factors that and considerations that we haven't covered. So in the example we are looking at here on the right, we make an assumption in terms of electricity price in the forthcoming years, when in reality they may go up or down. And we've all had experience of that recently and how much that can change. We assume the university pays 35 pence per kilowatt hour. I suspect it's actually less because we probably get a discount for buying a lot of it. That's based on the domestic rate. And that would obviously have a big impact in terms of the payback periods and the financial savings. Having done all of these calculations, that isn't what you take forward to a senior management group or your financial advisor in an organization. What you would take forward is a written business case, and the likelihood is these calculations would be part of an appendix to that written business case. So the other thing we ask the students to do is to write a business case in so many words. And of course, we set the word limit quite tight because in reality, that's what happens in an organization. You aren't given the opportunity to write pages and pages. It's got to be very succinct to the point, but it has to include everything that's relevant. So they're asked to then turn all these calculations into a written business case. And again, this is a great opportunity to actually draw on all the many stories, examples and anecdotes from the current work we do and also the work I did when I was at Manchester Airport. Thanks, Rach.
So the last unit we're just going to touch on very briefly is our level 6 circular economy unit. So this unit, as you can guess by its title, focuses on the circular economy. So the main skill building here that we're doing here is around conducting life cycle assessments. And we look both at environmental and social LCA. So in terms of relating specifically to carbon assessment, we do look at product level carbon footprinting here as an example of a simplified or single issue environmental life cycle assessment. And the students can select to do that for their actual assignment, which is a technical report presenting an LCA and identifying opportunities for improvement and making specific recommendations to a company to improve the performance of their product. That's all we're going to say about this, because we did want to leave plenty of time for discussion. So this is our final slide before we move on to that. It was just to sort of flag some key challenges and future perspectives, which we already heard a hint of in the feedback to the previous discussion. So one of the challenges that Chris and I find here is the rapidly evolving context. We are constantly updating our materials to make sure they remain relevant. Everything is changing under your feet. The state of play with regard to where we are in terms of our understanding of climate change, the extent to which it's going to change, the policy position, both at the international context and at the domestic level, the scale with which responses have already been implemented. So think about offshore wind farm development, for example, and all of that in the context of the current mechanisms of financial support and the current costs of energy. So that's a really administrative side, if you like, to how much we have to update these materials. They don't work year to year. We do have to rewrite pretty much every exercise to some extent. But the larger issue is that whole shift in the language that we see around this as a larger sort of subject area. We've both been in this field for a long time. Back when I started in carbon accounting and management education, there was a raging debate that the stronger opinion was probably we really shouldn't talk about adaptation, because if we talk about adaptation, then that's a distraction from what we really need to do, which is reduce our emissions, mitigate. And that is no longer the case. There's now the recognition of the urgent need for also adapting to climate change. I'm sure everyone saw the headlines associated with the projection that we're going to at least temporarily go over 1.5 degrees this decade. That's the latest best scientific assessment. So what we're also seeing is the recognition for the need for a holistic, integrated approach to climate risk management. So bringing the mitigation and the adaptation together, because if we don't do it together, then mitigative actions that we take could well result in maladaptation, or adaptive actions that we take might miss an opportunity. They might miss a potential synergy to also reduce our emissions. And we've stayed very focused here on looking just at climate change as a topic. But of course, this also integrates with all the other SDGs, and really notably with the nature crisis, so the biodiversity crisis, where addressing biodiversity loss, preserving our ecosystems, is also preserving our carbon stores. Restoring them can also help remove carbon from the atmosphere. Failure to take action puts nature under an even greater threat. So this need for a very integrated approach is fundamental, and we're already starting to reshape our approach to teaching this into this more holistic endeavour. Chris, was there anything you wanted to add there? I wasn't overly articulate, so.
No, I think you did just fine, Rach. I mean, it's just as you say, you know, everything changes every year, each year, doesn't it, in terms of cost, emission factors and so on. So there's always an element of doing that sort of administrative updating, as well as the taking a step back and looking at the broader picture.
Super, thank you. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and any questions? And we're only 2 minutes over where we aim to be.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Rachel and Chris. We kind of deliberately allowed plenty of time for questions. So if you've got any questions, please put your hand up or pop them in the chat. We've also had some of the students on the course are really interested in those courses and would love to do them. So what I've highlighted, Rach, is that, and Chris, is that we're looking at how at Manchester Met we can develop a centre where we can offer some of these activities more widely. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that before we go on to any other questions, very briefly, because they're very embryonic plans at the moment, aren't they?
Well, absolutely, it's on our ambition list, you know, our real wish list. So some of you in the room already know, I think it may have come up in all the breakout room discussions, but we've already shared all of our carbon literacy materials, so they're freely available to anyone in the FHE sector to pick up and use. And we'd really like to do the same with our sort of energy and carbon management materials. So get these set up as exercises that anyone can adopt and incorporate into their teaching.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Have you got any other questions or comments? I know, Michelle, your institution, you do quite a lot of this work. Do you want anything? Have you got anything to add to what we heard this morning, or just now rather?
It's a really interesting approach. We take a slightly different approach. A lot of the background that we do with our students is exactly the same, but we send them out to do carbon audits of our different university buildings, and they work very closely with our environmental manager of the university to get real-time data on energy use in the buildings, and we're hoping that we can then eventually send them out into the community and also offer that as a service more widely to some of the local schools and Portsmouth City Council, for example, that we work with on other things. So, but really similar approach. Our students really enjoy it because they see it as being a real world problem that they're seeking, and I think they really like the authentic assessment side of it as well, where they feel it's really meaningful. So they don't like the maths. I guess your students probably find that as well. I think that's probably our biggest challenge, but they are very engaged with it.
I think if I could just add in, yes, I think maths is a bit Marmite, isn't it? you love it or you hate it. But it's interesting what you say there. On the Sustainability of Organisations unit, we do a waste audit with the students. So it's not directly related to net zero, or obviously there are links there, but yes, we do take a similar approach, and we find ourselves looking at bins amongst other things. Yes.
Yeah, a bit smelly, isn't it?
Yeah.
No, thank you very much. Yeah, and also we're kind of, our students for carbon literacy go out and train other organisations, so we're really keen that, like you, Michelle, the carbon accounting, they go out and do the same in a kind of social enterprise, because it's great for their employability, isn't it? Thank you very much. Ian?
You kind of preempted me a bit there, Liz. In the breakout rooms, I was talking a little bit about the carbon literacy and the fact it was done outside of units. Rach, would you be able to add a little bit more about that? You've been more knowledgeable than me on it.
I didn't touch on that. I spoke about carbon literacy a couple of years ago, didn't I? Was it in this forum? I think it was, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've been delivering carbon literacy training, which is about it's about filling someone's bucket of care so that they understand the scale of the challenge and they feel empowered to take action. It's the hearts and minds part of the piece, if you like. And we've been delivering it within our department since 2015. I think we embedded it in 2017, Liz, would that be right? Yeah, so that's across
right.
all of our undergraduate programs, and we do it in different ways depending on the program and where it fits. It's not really sort of one size fits all. So it's been traditionally dominantly an extracurricular option, but embedded in little pockets, if you like, across the university. But we now have a commitment in our revised sustainability, leadership and sustainability strategy to embed carbon literacy training in all of our programs, both undergraduate and postgraduate, by 2026. So we're in the process of rolling that out across the institution. So we've trained around 100 champions from different departments all the way across the university, and they're taking the lead on how to incorporate it within their program. So it's being done in many, many different ways. For the environmental science students, I actually take them through it in their first 2 weeks. So we start in induction, but it follows through in the first 2 weeks of semester 1. For our geography students, it's slightly later in the year as an additional activity. So it is cool, they are expected to turn up, but it's timetabled in a similar way to the way field trips and so on are timetabled. In other parts of the university, it's split into 6 or 7 tutorials that run across a semester. It's all about how it integrates appropriately in the different contexts. But that's the toolkit that's freely available to anyone in the sector, and we cover the climate change challenge, so the sort of the science basics. Then we look at understanding carbon footprints, that covers international equity and fairness, like how they vary around the world, and then our own personal carbon footprints, the different components of those. Then we imagine what a zero carbon world would look like, and all the changes that we need to see to get there. Then we focus on the role of a university or a college in addressing that challenge. Then the students explore their future careers in that context. And then the final session is about them identifying what specific actions they're going to pledge to take in this transition. So it's a really nice foundational piece. And for our students, it really gives us a great opportunity to signpost to all the further skills building that's coming up later on in their programs as well.
Thanks, Rach. And we also, as Ian mentioned, and you mentioned, we train our students to be trainers as well, and they
I
train
always
other
forget really
students.
important things, don't I?
Yeah,
we also train them to help out as facilitators, but then also to go on to be trainers, and that's something that many of our students now have really great careers in and doing. So actually the manager of the Carbon Literacy Project is one of our alumni. She was in our first ever cohort of student trainers. So that's really nice too.
And thanks. And we're keen to do similar things with the carbon accounting and carbon management, aren't we?